On the night of January 3rd, 1804, a 22-year-old man named Thomas Millwood sat inside of a local pub in Hammersmith, England, feeling totally annoyed. Now, normally, Thomas was a very upbeat and social person. He worked as a bricklayer, and basically every day after work, he would meet up with his friends at this pub. They would have some drinks and share stories and laugh. It would be a great time. But tonight, it was like everything annoyed Thomas, especially his friends. And as his friends droned on and on about the current drama going on in their town, Thomas finally had just had enough, and before he could stop himself, he stood up and slammed his beer mug down on the table, and right away Thomas knew he had overdone it, because immediately the pub went deadly silent, his friends all stopped, everybody's looking over at Thomas, and Thomas kind of muttered an apology, and then quickly grabbed his coat, he stood up, and just began walking like he was going to leave the pub. And the pub, again, is totally silent as he's walking, and then right as he's about to go out the door, his friends broke the tense silence in the pub, and they called out to him and said, "Hey, be careful out there." And Thomas just looked at his friends and kind of rolled his eyes and said, "Yeah, okay." And then he went outside. Thomas decided he would walk to his parents' house, which was not far away, and he would just sit by the fire and warm up for a bit before he had to go back out later that night to meet up with his wife. His wife worked long hours and she often worked late, and when she worked late, Thomas would meet her at work and escort her back home. And that's what he was doing tonight. And so Thomas began walking down Black Lion Lane, and per usual, Thomas was basically one of the only people outside. Hammersmith used to be this very friendly and bustling place. It was home to 45,000 people. It was located right on the outskirts of London, and lots of rich people like to go there to vacation. But recently, there had been a string of all these increasingly bizarre sightings, or attacks as people were calling them, in Hammersmith, and it had all the residents completely on edge to the point where people were not going outside. Now, Thomas thought it was totally ridiculous and thought people were completely overreacting, and so he had been doing his best to ignore the drama going on in town, but it was getting harder and harder to do that. As Thomas rounded a corner, he nearly walked into two men that were walking the other direction. And when Thomas looked up to say he was sorry, one of the men screamed, "Get back!" And he was holding a club in his hand, and the other guy had a pistol in his waist, and he had his hand on the pistol grip. Thomas instinctively threw his hands up to show he was not a threat, at which point the man lowered his club, and the other guy took his hand off his pistol, and one of them said to Thomas, "Hey, it's dangerous to be out here alone. You should not be out here by yourself." And then before Thomas could say anything to them, they quickly walked past him and disappeared around the corner. By now, Thomas was only a few houses away from his parents' house, and so he just kind of brushed off the incident and sped walked his way to his parents' house, kind of cursing the two men under his breath for their ridiculous warning about how dangerous it was out here. A minute later, Thomas arrived at his parents' house, and he walked up to the door, and normally his parents would keep the door unlocked, but when he tried it, it was locked, and then a second later, he heard his sister, Anne, inside the house coming to the door, and she called out through the door, "Who's there?" And Thomas is like, "It's me, Anne." But apparently that was not enough, and Anne called through the door, "Well, I don't know if it's really you, so back up so I can see you through the peephole." Thomas rolled his eyes, but he did what his sister asked. He stepped back and allowed her to see his whole person through the peephole, at which point he heard Anne fumbling with the lock. The door was unlocked. She opened it up. Thomas stepped inside, and his sister immediately shut and locked the door behind him. And her first question to Thomas was, "Well, did you see it?" Thomas immediately wished he had not come to his parents' house to avoid talking about this stupid topic, but he realized that if he had gone back to his house, he likely would have gotten the same question from his mother-in-law, who lived with him and his wife. Because actually, it didn't really seem to matter where you went in Hammersmith or who you talked to, because the conversation was always going to be the same. It was going to be about these attacks, because the people of Hammersmith were absolutely convinced these attacks were being committed by a ghost. It all started about 2 months earlier when somebody spotted this mysterious figure lurking in the church cemetery. And Thomas thought really the hysteria should have stopped right then and there, because only a couple of days after the sighting, it was figured out that the figure was actually just the butcher's son, and he was just dressing up in women's clothes, walking around in the cemetery to scare his friends. It was a prank, that was it. But the hysteria in town did not go away, because a week after this first weird sighting, there was another sighting in the cemetery. A local chimney sweep said he saw someone walking around in the cemetery who disappeared into the ground. Now, admittedly, a lot of people in Hammersmith, when they heard about this second sighting, they did kind of brush it off as just hysteria. But it was after this second sighting that these so-called attacks began in town. late one night, a local resident was walking past the cemetery when something came up behind them and began choking them, and this resident was able to break free and run away to safety, but they turned and got a look at whatever was attacking them, and they described it as a phantom. Shortly after that, a local carriage driver was going past the cemetery when they got out for some reason, and then this creature with horns on its head came charging out and confronted the carriage driver, who apparently just turned and ran away, abandoning his 8 horses and 16 passengers. And so by late December, there had been so many more of these strange attacks and weird sightings in town that basically everybody in Hammersmith, save for basically Thomas, was totally gripped by fear. And as terror kind of spread across town, Thomas had attempted to convince his wife and mother-in-law and his family that there was just no way this was a real ghost. This is people's paranoia and their imaginations running wild. That's all this is. But Thomas's theory was really put into question when just a few days earlier, so a few days before he stormed out of the pub because he was so annoyed, somebody had died following one of these attacks. A pregnant woman had died. The woman had been walking alone near the church cemetery at about 10 p.m. at night when something in the cemetery had rose up out of the ground, rushed over to her, and grabbed onto her, and she barely had time to kind of turn and look, and she saw this kind of white flowing robe and a long pointed white hat, and that was all she remembered, because then she passed out. Then she woke up again and she was in somebody's house and her neighbors were all around her. They had found her passed out in the cemetery and carried her there. And so she comes to, and she's only able to choke out the story of what happened to her, the ghost attack, before she died. And so following this pregnant woman's death, the town of Hammersmith offered a reward for anybody who could capture or kill the ghost, which was now being dubbed the Hammersmith ghost. The night watchmen began doing extra patrols. In fact, those 2 men that Thomas had turned the corner and bumped into, one guy had the club, the other guy had a gun, those guys were on their own patrol. And so the ghost and how to capture or kill it was basically the only thing people in Hammersmith wanted to talk about, and it totally annoyed Thomas. It was what was being talked about at the pub by his friends when he got so mad he slammed the cup down and left the pub. To Thomas, the idea of capturing or killing a ghost made no sense because a ghost is not real. Now, by this point, the butcher's son had come out and said, look, I didn't do any of these other attacks. That's not me. I only did the first one. And he had an alibi to prove it. But to Thomas, this didn't rule out that the ghost was not a person. To Thomas, he just felt like, okay, then there's somebody else in town that's just copying the butcher's son's prank, except obviously they've taken the pranks too far because they've gotten someone killed. At about 10 p.m., Thomas was inside of his parents' house, sitting by the fire, just kind of beginning to doze off. And as he sat there, he thought to himself how little he wanted to go out into the freezing cold night to go walk with his wife all the way back home. He'd much rather just stay here and sleep for the night and let his wife walk home on her own. But when he floated this idea to his sister Anne, who was standing nearby, she exploded on him and was like, are you kidding me? You're going to let your wife walk home alone in this environment? She's going to be the next victim of the Hammersmith ghost. Get out there and protect your wife. Thomas was like, okay. And he got up, he grabbed his jacket, and he walked outside. As soon as Thomas was outside, he was feeling so annoyed at the current situation that he found himself thinking, you know what? If I run into that stupid Hammersmith ghost, the person disguised as a ghost, I'm gonna bum rush them and beat them up. And it will prove to the entire town that there was never any ghost. It was just a person the whole time. And so Thomas began walking briskly down the road. He turned onto Black Lion Lane, and immediately he saw this big bush off to the side of the road on the sidewalk, and he could have sworn behind this bush there was something or someone crouched down, like they were trying to hide. And so Thomas stopped and he squinted in the direction of this bush, and then at some point he saw movement enough to confirm to him that that must be a person back there, and suddenly it clicked for Thomas. That must be the person pretending to be this ghost. That's the prankster / murderer. There they are. And so without any hesitation, Thomas balled up his fists and just started sprinting towards this person. At virtually the exact same time, Anne, Thomas's sister, was still in their parents' house, and she was looking out the window kind of roughly in the direction that Thomas had gone, and she heard this loud scream that sounded like a man. Now, she couldn't see her brother, but she's thinking, oh my God, it's coming roughly from the area where he went. What if he's getting attacked by the ghost? And so she bolted outside. Just a couple of minutes after that, a big posse of men came tumbling out of that pub where Thomas had been drinking earlier that night and got really mad and slammed his cup down. So they come stumbling out of the pub, and they were being led not by the night watchman, who was amongst the posse, but instead they were being led by the town's tax collector, a man named Francis Smith, who looked totally disheveled and out of breath and did not look like the type of guy who would be leading a big posse. But here we were. He was leading this posse, and he took them down the road, and they turned the corner onto Black Lion Lane, and as soon as they looked down that same road that Thomas had been on and then seen the person in the bush, the posse, they stopped because they saw a body in the middle of the road, and it didn't appear to be moving. And then crouched over the body was this dark figure that was kind of hunched over this body. And the figure turned and it looked at the posse and let out this unbelievable scream. And the posse just kind of backed up and didn't know what to do. But then the night watchman broke ranks and just began sprinting at the creature that was perched over the body. And the watchman tackled the creature onto the ground and kind of pinned it there. At the same time, the rest of the posse, seeing an opening, rushed over to the body in the road to see if maybe they were alive and if maybe they could help this person. But unfortunately, when they got to the body, they could tell this person was dead. The posse believed they had just discovered the latest victim of the Hammersmith ghost and the Hammersmith ghost themselves, the black creature that the watchman tackled onto the ground. But they were wrong. When Thomas had rounded the corner onto Black Lion Lane and he looked into that bush and he saw that figure moving around, it really was a person. It was not a ghost, it was a human being. It was Francis Smith, the town's tax collector, and he was hiding behind the bush. However, Francis was not hiding behind the bush because he was pretending to be the Hammersmith ghost, like Thomas was assuming, which is why he ran after him. Instead, Francis was hiding behind that bush because he was basically laying in wait for the Hammersmith ghost. He was hoping the ghost would walk past him and he could run out and capture or kill this thing and get the reward. Basically, Francis was doing the same thing Thomas was doing. The only difference was Francis actually believed in the ghost and Thomas did not. And it was just Thomas's bad luck that that night he had chosen to wear his all-white work clothes, which to Francis, who's hiding in the bush, terrified and waiting for the ghost, he sees Thomas in these white clothes and he was absolutely convinced he was the Hammersmith ghost. And so when the two men spotted each other, they both attacked, except Francis had a rifle. And so when Thomas ran up to him to basically punch him in the face, Francis just raised his gun and fired. And the bullet hit Thomas directly in the face, which killed him instantly. But after shooting and killing Thomas, Francis had no idea that it was a real person. He was so jacked up on adrenaline that he did think he shot the ghost, but didn't know if the ghost was actually dead or not, and he didn't want to be alone when he checked, so he just turned and ran to the pub, gathered up the posse, and said, "Hey, I got the ghost, come on!" And they all ran back to Black Lion Lane, and when they got there, Thomas's sister, Anne, who heard that scream, she had made it to her brother's body, and she was the creature crouched over him, screaming out of grief. That's all she was doing. She had just found her dead brother and was reacting to it when the watchman tackled her to the ground. But luckily, the posse quickly realized this is not a ghost, this is Thomas and his sister, and so his sister was not harmed. And so, on January 11th, 1804, Francis Smith was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. But 5 weeks later, the King of England would pardon Francis and shorten his sentence to just 1 year. The Hammersmith ghost incident was debated for more than 150 years, and ultimately it led to a modern-day ruling that says a person is allowed to use self-defense if they truly and reasonably believe they're in danger, even if they are wrong about the danger they face. The true identity of the Hammersmith ghost, not the very first one, which we know was the butcher's son, but all the other instances, all the other attacks, well, it would turn out it was the town's shoemaker who would confess to his crime following Thomas's murder. He would tell people that the only reason he did it was to get revenge on his apprentices who had really badly scared his children by telling them ghost stories. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch.